Have I beaten the general disdain for authoritarian government assholes into you yet? No? Well, in that case, I suppose the beating shall continue for the foreseeable future. Let's talk about Antonio Consejero. 100% butchered the ever-loving fuck out of that name. Be mentally prepared for Lot Part 2 in that regard. You want a story of government assholes being government assholes? Look no further than Brazil. Who would have seen that one coming? Our protagonist for today comes out swinging simply because Antonio Consejero is not his actual name. His actual name was Antonio Vicente Mendez Maciel, and Antonio Consejero wasn't a moniker used until much later, roughly translating to Anthony the Counselor. I think that gives you a pretty good idea about this guy already, but I need to pretend y'all are incapable of inferring from context or else I really wouldn't have a video here now, would I? Anyways, our friend was born in Quixeramobim in the state of Sierra on March 13th, 1830 in what was then the Empire of Brazil. Yeah, more fun names. He was born to a ranch family, and his early life was characterized by being unlucky as fuck. His mother died when he was quite young, and when his father remarried, he turned to the bottle, and the new stepmother was apparently rather abusive. Overall, not the best starting hand in the world. He went to live with his grandfather to get some education done, and he did quite well for himself, developing a reputation as a good student and overall a pretty smart dude. In 1857, he would get married to, I believe, his cousin, and around that time he began to find work, primarily as a school teacher and lay counselor, which is like a lawyer, but for the people who need to, invoke their right to a lawyer and legal counsel. See, the name is starting to make sense, yeah? It's also helpful to know that he was raised a very devout Christian, which, I mean, given location and time period, it makes sense, but it's extremely important for the direction this guy's life is gonna go. His parents originally wanted him to become a clergyman, but that kinda went kaput when his mother died. Unbeknownst to him, however, fate had different plans. He would have 2 kids before his wife, I think, cheated on him? I don't know. Everywhere seems to dance around the word, but I think the phrase marital treason, that's a fucking translation, holy shit, only really has one meaning. This naturally made him quite upset, since, you know, if my wife committed marital treason, I'd be upset too. He got very depressed and went, "Aight, fuck y'all, I'll see ya never," and pissed off to the country to live on a farm and do some teaching in 1861. Of course, though, we wouldn't be here if this guy just vibed here for 40 years. He went hard into Christianity, partially as a coping mechanism, I'd assume, and specifically leaned into mysticism, which has gotta be some kind of heresy, but hey, I ain't here to judge. He had a brief affair with a woman that yielded him a 3rd child, but pretty soon after he dipped to become a wandering pilgrim sometime in or around 1865. From here he went around the country and did pretty standard Christ-like things, like preaching, teaching and providing counsel to the poor, and in general being a pretty okay dude. He lived as a beggar, sleeping in the back rooms of whoever would let him into their home. He was apparently a pretty moving dude, because he began to amass a considerable following of people, many of whom would travel with him when he moved on. The ones he preached to were the ones who gave him the name Antonio Consejero, and it definitely stuck. Most notable about this particular section of his life was his popularity with the oppressed and downtrodden. The poor, the peasants, society's undesirables, the common man, and most importantly, the slaves. He hated slavery. Unfortunately, though, around this time, the Brazilian economy was almost entirely propped up by slavery, and the wealthy landowners and aristocrats didn't like some unshaven upstart messing with their status quo. Furthermore, his rather unorthodox beliefs and increasing following had pissed off the Catholic Church a fair bit. As much as he would have liked to remain a peaceful guy, the elites, trademark, would make that very difficult in the coming years. His first brush with the government would be in 1876, when he was arrested in the state of Bahia because they suspected him of being a wanted criminal for some fucking reason. Remember, kids, never trust a Fed. They shipped him back to his hometown, beating him quite savagely on the way there, and put him on trial. The judge was a G, though, and basically went, "Yeah, what the fuck? Why is this guy even here?" and promptly let him go. He quickly went back to Bahia to continue his little mission, building churches and preaching. It was good that he did return, because the next year, northeastern Brazil was hit by a drought of biblical proportions. It lasted 2 years and killed an estimated 500,000 people, and caused around 200,000 more to migrate to other places in Brazil. Overall, a pretty shit time. Consejero was a man of action, so naturally he led his by now very large following in helping the suffering population in any way he could, primarily by assisting those refugees fleeing the catastrophe in finding food, protection, and shelter, and by organizing people for public works projects. As with any natural disaster, a certain subset of these people would call this some sort of divine punishment, and would look to religion for answers. And in religion, these answers were found. Many looked at Consejero and went, "Damn, he looks an awful lot like that Jesus fella, eh?" And the natural connection to make when you are cold, scared, and starving is that this Jesus-looking fella is obviously a prophet sent by God to help you, so his followership exploded even further, with many seeing him as much more than just a pious holy man. By this point, the church is freaking out, so in 1882, they moved to curb his influence, with the Archbishop of Bahia issuing a decree that labeled Conselheiro an apostate. This did nothing to stop his following from growing though, and a little event in this decade was about to throw him into the spotlight in a way that would cause his enemies to move to put him down for good. On May 13th of 1888, the Empire of Brazil formally abolished slavery. This had several immediate effects on the nation, most notably the fact that there were now several million new free people in the country who weren't willing to keep working on farms. The landowners were naturally upset that all of their production was gone, and pretty much the entire agricultural sector had to rebuild itself from scratch. Conselheiro was fucking ecstatic though. Like I said previously, he hated slavery and often preached to slaves during his travels. This had the effect of huge numbers of freed slaves joining his party. Change in Brazil wasn't done yet though, as 1 year later the monarchy would be overthrown in a military coup and replaced with a republic. Yeah, the country basically underwent several decades of change in 2 years, so naturally there was a great deal of strife as the regime stabilized. The millions of freed slaves were flooding the cities, the Republican government was busy smushing resistance, everyone was in a tizzy over the current state of affairs, and everyone was just a little bit stressed. Conselheiro, for his part, thought republicanism was kinda cringe, believing in that whole divine right of kings thing. This did not help his reputation with the upper strata. So, now the church hates him for being unorthodox, the landowners, farmers, and upper class hate him for giving the slaves and the poor ideas, and the new Republican government hates him for being a reactionary monarchist. Furthermore, his criticism was getting very public, and the government was just about done with his bullshit. All of the pieces were in place for shit to go down, and go down it absolutely would. After some more trouble with the law, he elected to end his wandering and settle down. So in 1893, he took his followers to a place near the village of Canudos, in the backland of Bahia, and founded a village of his own. The place was nestled neatly in a valley, making it very well protected. It was here where Conselheiro would spend the rest of his life. It could very much be described as a Christian commune, and as you may know, can't have any commies in South America, now can we? Regardless, the place was stupid popular and was fairly developed by all accounts, and in 2 years would have ballooned to an estimated population of 30,000 people, making it the second largest settlement in Bahia. Of course, though, the government wasn't about to let a peaceful settlement of dissenters go unmolested. The whole thing, probably, started with an argument over wood. Conselheiro ordered lumber from Juazeiro, which is something he did a fair bit, so nothing out of the ordinary. The new judge in the area, though, did not like him, so he blocked the delivery. Naturally, a tad miffed, some of his followers decided to go to Juazeiro to get the shit that they had paid for. Upon hearing this, the judge, the conniving little shit that he was, promptly went, "Oh no, the crazies are gonna invade my town, whatever shall I do?" He then bitched to the state government, who agreed to send some guys to make sure they didn't try anything funny. The judge, however, was able to convince the soldiers to strike first and attack Canudos in November of 1896. The Conselheiristas, which I guess was the collective name of his followers, learned of this and ambushed the soldiers en route and forced them to retreat. The media and state government blew this way the fuck out of proportion. Suddenly, it was an organized monarchist plot to overthrow the republic. So, the federal government decided that an example was to be made, and what is called the War of Canudos began in earnest. The first federal attack on Canudos proper came on November 21st. They had a little over 100 men, and severely underestimated the value of fanaticism and defensible terrain, so the attack was repulsed. This second defeat only frenzied everyone even more. Clearly, these radicals are doing some kind of tomfuckery if they're winning against a modern army. A third attack came on January 18th of 1897, which had almost 600 men and met some moderate success before the army was apparently encircled by upwards of 4,000 Conselheiristas and was again forced to pull back. Casualties seemingly did not matter to the inhabitants of the town, and they fought with savage ferocity that forced the military to step back and rethink what the hell it was doing. The government couldn't ignore the fact that they were getting their asses beat, since it was starting to make them look bad, so the Conselheiristas were labeled a genuine threat to the state and were ordered to be crushed by any means necessary. Conselheiro himself wasn't an active participant in most of this combat. He was a preacher, not a general, and he seemed genuinely saddened by the death and really didn't like the fact that this is how things ended up. Slaughtering innocents because they disagree with the government is very Christ-like, obviously. One man's objections couldn't stop the inevitable, however, and the Third Army assault would begin on March 4th with 1,300 men brought to end things. This time, the attack went very wrong. The previous 3 clashes were sort of inconclusive, but this one was about as decisive as it gets. The army got Russian-wintered bottom text because the backlands of Brazil are a very shitty place, so their equipment failed and their supply trains were slowed dramatically. When they got into Canudos proper, it was was pretty much a turkey shoot. Urban combat sucks, who would have guessed, and in 2 days a retreat was ordered. The commanding officer was also killed, causing a general panic and a near total rout of the army forces. The Conselheiristas took control of their left-behind weapons, ammo, and artillery. Now, the government was genuinely freaking out. The general public was rioting over the repeated failures, and the reputation of the army was tarnished. Not all was well with the inhabitants of Canudos either, however. The siege-like conditions they were in left them bereft of food and water, along with previously taken casualties reducing their strength considerably. This time, nothing was left to chance. Machine guns and heavy artillery were brought by over 3,000 men, personally commanded by the Minister of War to put them down. The first attack made in June during this offensive was inconclusive, though with extreme casualties on both sides. No, we're not doing this shit again. No, fucking kill them. Another 5,000 men were brought in as reinforcements, and with these numbers they were able to encircle and lay siege to Canudos. For 3 months the settlers were ravaged by disease and hunger, but still they resisted to the bitter end. A final assault was made on October 5th of 1897, and finally, the Conselheiristas broke. The army was not kind to the population. The entire settlement was razed to the ground, and those who did not flee beforehand were slaughtered like dogs. An estimated 25,000 inhabitants were murdered during the course of the conflict. Only 150 would be spared. As for Conselheiro, his body was found and taken before the town was razed. It's believed he died of dysentery on September 22nd, 1897, at the age of 67. He hated the suffering of his followers, and it's likely that his extensive fasting at least partially led to his death when the disease came knocking. After his body was confirmed by surgeons, his head was cut off and displayed on a spike before being sent to the medical school of Bahia as an exhibition piece. Not exactly a noble death by any fucking stretch of the imagination. The Republican government obviously declared this a glorious victory, and the war did help strengthen the new regime's legitimacy and gave them a perfect propaganda piece to show monarchism as a backwards ideology that only sought to tear down the progress the Republic was supposedly making. As days and weeks turned to decades, however, successive governments moved to redeem his reputation somewhat, with him going from a religious lunatic to a martyr of his beliefs. His original home in Kexaramabim is preserved as a museum, and the land where Canudos once sat is the site of a state park that serves to honor the legacy of the war as an important piece of Brazilian history. The conflict serves as a neat anchor point in history, serving almost as a definitive end of an era moment for both Brazilian monarchism and the 19th century as a whole. The quote-unquote war itself has had its perspective shifted as well, being rebranded as what it really was: a tragic massacre of innocent people where thousands were cut down for the crime of defending their homes and livelihoods. Interestingly, the park is overseen by a statue of Antonio Conselheiro himself, showing that the legacy he left behind is just as interesting as the man himself. That about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.